The Rilthar Council laughs at the idea of a mysterious human fleet entering their space. But when the human fleet reveals its true power, the Empire's confidence crumbles and fear takes root. What was once considered an insignificant threat is now a force that even the Rilthar can't ignore. The Rilthar council room was filled with the sound of mocking laughter. Zithar, seated at the head of the table, could barely contain his amusement as the holographic image of the human fleet appeared on the screen before him. The transmission had come in without warning, a cryptic message from the depths of human space, nothing but static and distorted signals. But the message was clear enough for him to dismiss it with a wave of his hand. "What is this?" Zithar sneered. "A fleet of primitive ships, some half-baked attempt at a threat? They don't even have proper shields." Vrish, the youngest of the council, leaned in and squinted at the image. "They're definitely not what I'd call a fleet," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Look at them. They're barely out of the Stone Age compared to our armadas." Zithar's laughter echoed through the chamber. "The humans think they can challenge us. They don't even have the technological capabilities to breach our outer defenses. This is nothing more than a laughable display. They should have never entered our space." His arrogance was evident. The Rilthar Empire had conquered worlds, decimated fleets, and wiped out civilizations. Their superiority was undeniable, and this was a feeble gesture from a species they had already considered beneath them. Vrish chuckled, shaking her head. "Let them waste their time. We'll crush them without lifting a finger." But the other councillors, who had been as confident as Zithar only moments before, began to look less certain. There was something about this human fleet, something hidden beneath its primitive appearance. A nagging suspicion crept into their minds, but for now, the majority of them decided to ignore the inkling of doubt. They had underestimated many species before, and they had always triumphed. The humans would be no different. In the heart of the human fleet, Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of the flagship, staring out at the Rilthar forces on the horizon. His face was unreadable, his posture still, but there was a fire burning within him. The time for underestimation was over. Today, humanity would show the galaxy exactly what they were capable of. The fleet was unlike anything the Rilthar had seen. The ships were far from perfect, rough around the edges, cobbled together from a hodgepodge of old technology and scraps. Yet they were far more than the Rilthar could comprehend. They were human ingenuity and defiance in their purest form. "We've been underestimated," Hayes said, his voice calm but heavy with purpose. "But they won't laugh after today. We've been quiet too long. Let's show them why humanity is not to be taken lightly." His officers moved quickly, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. The ship's engines hummed with power, and the crew prepared for the task ahead. Hayes knew the odds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but he also knew that no fleet, no empire, could match the resolve of a species fighting for its survival. "We're about to rewrite history," Hayes muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "And they'll regret thinking they could just walk all over us." Zithar, still basking in his confidence, watched the human fleet on the screen as it closed the distance. The ships had barely begun their approach when his tactical officer spoke up, his voice tense. "Sir, the human fleet is activating something. Their energy signatures, they're spiking." Zithar turned sharply, his expression one of disbelief. "What do you mean, spiking? They're not capable of—" Before he could finish, the first blast from the human fleet hit. It was not just any blast. It was a devastating, high-powered beam that tore through the front of one of the Rilthar's smaller ships with terrifying ease. The ship disintegrated in an instant, a massive explosion that sent debris scattering into the void. The Rilthar Council froze. A shocked silence filled the room as Zithar's earlier confidence melted into something darker. Dread. What is this?" Vrish stammered, her eyes wide as she stared at the destruction unfolding before them. "This isn't possible." Their weapons are too primitive. How could they do this? Zithar, no longer laughing, clenched his fists. The first shot from the humans had shattered their expectations, and the enemy fleet was now barreling towards them with a relentless fury. The primitive ships had weapons that could match, if not exceed, the Rilthar's most advanced technology. He barked orders, trying to regain control. Return fire. Concentrate all weapons on their flagship. We cannot allow them to get any closer. But as the human ships continued their assault, each shot landing with deadly accuracy, Zithar realized the truth. The humans had something that the Rilthar didn't understand, something they had never encountered, and it was tearing through their empire with an efficiency that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The arrogance of the Rilthar had blinded them, and now they were paying the price for it. The battle raged on. The once proud Rilthar fleet, once a symbol of dominance, was crumbling before the unstoppable human assault. The remaining ships of the Empire tried to fight back, but the tide had turned, and no one had seen it coming. As another Rilthar ship was destroyed, Zithar stood, eyes wide, his body tense with disbelief. They had underestimated the humans, and now the Empire was on the verge of collapse. And that was before Earth even responded. The battle had become something unrecognizable. What had once been a proud, confident Rilthar fleet was now reduced to chaos, with debris and wreckage floating aimlessly in the void. The humans, once dismissed as weak and insignificant, had proven their might in a single devastating strike. Their fleet, though small and seemingly unimportant, had shattered the Rilthar's pride in ways no one could have predicted. Zithar, the once unshakable leader of the Rilthar Empire, stood frozen in front of the viewscreen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The human fleet was relentless. Their weapons tore through the Rilthar's defenses with ease. Every shot fired from the human ships landed with perfect precision, and every strike seemed to chip away at the once dominant Empire. "Return fire!" Zithar barked, but his voice was hollow. It lacked the confidence he had once commanded. The command room was tense, filled with the sounds of alarms and frantic officers scrambling to carry out orders. The tactical officers at their stations were now frantic, eyes wide in disbelief. "We're losing power to the shield, sir. The human fire is too concentrated," one officer reported, his voice shaking. Zithar's mind raced. He had been so sure of their superiority, so certain that the Rilthar fleet would crush these so-called humans without breaking a sweat. But now their ships were being destroyed one after another, and the remaining forces were scattered. Their proud warships were nothing more than flaming husks drifting in space. "How?" Zithar muttered under his breath. "How could they do this?" Vrish, one of his most trusted counselors, was equally stunned. She stood at a console across the room, her eyes glued to the screens. "They shouldn't have this power. These humans, they've somehow found a way to surpass our technology." "How?" Zithar looked over at her, his eyes burning with anger. "It doesn't matter how. We need to retaliate now. We can't let them have the last word. If we allow them to win this battle, the Rilthar will be finished." Another explosion rocked the flagship, and Zithar barely held on to his seat. The force was enough to shake the ship to its core. A few seconds later, a tactical officer called out, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Sir, the human flagship is advancing toward us. They're coming for the kill." Zithar's heart raced. This was it. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. This was a full-scale assault. And the humans were taking no prisoners. "Prepare all weapons. Engage them with everything we've got," Zithar ordered, his voice strained. The idea of retreat, of admitting failure, was more than he could bear. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. Back on the human flagship, Captain Hayes stood at the center of the bridge, his eyes glued to the main screen. The Rilthar fleet, once a symbol of unstoppable Power was now breaking apart before his very eyes. The human warships, though smaller and seemingly less advanced, had found their rhythm. Each strike from their weapons hit with devastating accuracy, tearing apart the Rilthar's outer defenses with ease. "Keep the pressure on them," Hayes said, his voice calm but commanding. "We can't afford to slow down now. This is the moment we've been waiting for." Ava, his second-in-command, turned to him with a grim expression. "The Rilthar are not going to give up easily. They'll retaliate with everything they have. We've already taken losses. We can't keep up this pace for much longer without reinforcements." Hayes nodded. He knew this was a risky move, but they didn't have the luxury of time. If the Rilthar regrouped, they would be back in full force. The humans would need to end this now or face the full wrath of the Rilthar Empire. "We have no choice but to finish it," Hayes said, his eyes hardening. "We've shown them that humanity is not to be underestimated, but we need to make sure they never think they can challenge us again." He turned to his tactical officer. "Target their command ship. Take it out now." The officer nodded, hands flying over the controls. "Firing now, Captain, in the Rilthar flagship." The crew had lost any semblance of composure. Zithar watched as the human ships closed in, preparing to deliver the final blow. His pride, his empire, everything was crumbling. The thought of retreat crossed his mind, but he dismissed it instantly. There would be no retreat, not after everything the Rilthar had built. The humans had not only proven themselves capable, they had humiliated him and his people in front of the entire galaxy. "Engage the last reserve fighters," Zithar ordered, through clenched teeth. "We fight to the last ship, to the last man. We will not let them destroy us without a fight." The reserve fighters launched, their engines roaring as they shot toward the human fleet. But even as they moved into position, Zithar knew it was futile. The humans had already broken through their lines. No amount of desperation would change. And that on the human side, the final strike came in a blinding flash. The human flagship fired a concentrated beam directly at the heart of the Rilthar command ship. The energy blast struck true, and in the span of seconds, the Rilthar flagship, once the symbol of their dominance, was gone, reduced to a fiery explosion. The remaining Rilthar ships, now leaderless, scattered in all directions. Some attempted to fight back, but their will was broken. The human fleet moved swiftly, picking off the remaining targets one by one, until the once mighty Rilthar fleet was nothing more than a distant memory, drifting in space like the remnants of a fallen empire. Zithar stood amidst the wreckage of his command room, his body trembling with a mix of disbelief and rage. His empire, his pride, had been destroyed by the very species he had dismissed as weak. The Rilthar were no more than dust in the stars now. The silence that followed was deafening. The Rilthar had been vanquished, and the galaxy would never forget the humans who had brought them to their knees. As Hayes stood on the bridge of the human flagship, he looked at the stars ahead of him. They thought it was mercy. It wasn't. Humanity had proven its place in the galaxy. The Rilthar would never make the same mistake again. The aftermath of the battle hung heavy in the air. The Rilthar fleet had been decimated, reduced to smoldering debris drifting silently in the void. The human ships, though battered and scarred from the fight, stood victorious, their once primitive hulls now the symbols of a newfound power in the galaxy. Yet Captain Hayes felt no triumph in his chest. The victory had been hard-earned, and there was a gnawing sense of foreboding in the pit of his stomach. The Rilthar may have been defeated, but Hayes knew this wasn't the end of the war. It was only the beginning. He stood at the front of the bridge, gazing out at the space ahead. The stars seemed distant now, almost unreachable, as if the victory they had just won was as fleeting as the light from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. The silence on the bridge was thick, broken only by the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional crackle of communication from the other fleet members. Ava, Hayes said without turning, his voice steady. Any word from Earth? Lieutenant Ava looked up from her console. Nothing yet, Captain, but I'm sure they'll be sending reinforcements soon. We've received some messages, but they're all focused on internal reports. The damage is severe, but we've held our ground. Hayes nodded, the weight of the situation settling in. They'll be expecting us to follow up. The Rilthar won't stay down for long. Ava didn't respond immediately. She knew as well as he did that this victory wasn't just a triumph for Earth, it was a wake-up call to every other empire in the galaxy. The humans had just destroyed the Rilthar fleet, something no one thought possible. But now that they had shown their strength, they would have to fight to keep it. The Rilthar had been humiliated, and they wouldn't rest until they regained their pride. Hayes knew that better than anyone. Captain, one of the tactical officers called out, we've detected a faint signal from the outer rim. It's a distress call from a Rilthar cruiser. They're attempting to regroup. The tension in the room shifted. Hayes turned quickly. Patch it through. The screen flickered to life, and a voice came through, strained and desperate. This is Commander Valthar of the Rilthar Imperial Navy. We are requesting immediate assistance. Our fleet has been decimated. We need reinforcements. The transmission cut off suddenly, and the screen returned to static. Hayes's mind raced. There was no doubt now. The Rilthar weren't finished. They were broken but not defeated. This distress signal was just the first of many. Get me the fleet commanders, Hayes ordered. Prepare to move out. We can't let them regroup. We're going after them before they can escape. Ava turned to him, her face serious. Are you sure, Captain? The fleet is still recovering. We've suffered heavy casualties. We need time to repair before we can go after them. Time we don't have, Hayes replied, his voice hard. We take the fight to them now. While they're vulnerable, we finish this. We don't give them a chance to rebuild. We need to make sure they never dare to challenge us again. Ava hesitated, but she could see the fire in his eyes. There was no stopping him now. Understood, Captain. I'll get the orders out. As Ava relayed the orders, Hayes remained at the viewport, his eyes scanning the wreckage of the Rilthar fleet. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The victory had been swift, but the enemy was far from gone. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. Humanity had won this round, but the cost of complacency would be far greater in the long run. The human fleet, though battered, was ready. Ships that had once been part of an experiment, clunky, imperfect designs, were now the spearhead of a new chapter in human history. As Hayes stood on the bridge, the weight of leadership pressed down on him. This wasn't just about fighting. This was about survival, about ensuring that the Rilthar understood one thing: humanity was no longer to be underestimated. We're moving out, Hayes announced. Form up the fleet. Prepare to intercept the Rilthar cruiser. We finish what we started. The crew sprang into action. Every station was filled with purposeful movement as the ship's engines roared to life and the fleet began to shift positions. Hayes turned to Ava. Make sure the fleet stays tight. We're going to need everything we've got. Meanwhile, on the Rilthar cruiser, Commander Valthar's mind was a storm of frustration and fear. His fleet had been shattered. The humans had caught them by surprise and taken everything. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying for it. The distress signal had been sent in desperation, but even as it had been transmitted, Valthar knew it wouldn't be enough. The Rilthar Empire was a powerful force, but now it had been reduced to mere fragments, and those fragments were now hunted prey. We're not going to survive this, one of the officers muttered, his eyes glued to the screens. The humans, they're coming for us. Valthar clenched his fists. We won't go down without a fight. Prepare to engage any remaining forces. We may be beaten, but we'll make sure they remember us. The bridge was quiet for a moment as everyone prepared for what was sure to be their last stand. The cruiser was badly damaged, the remaining crew exhausted, and the Rilthar Empire was fractured. But Valthar knew that if he could somehow rally the few remaining ships, there was still a chance, though slim, that they could make a comeback. The human fleet arrived faster than the Rilthar could react. Captain Hayes stood firm as he watched the Rilthar cruiser appear on the horizon. His heart raced, not from fear, but from a deep, burning resolve. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. He wasn't going to let the Rilthar regroup and come back stronger. "Target their engines," Hayes ordered. "We need to cripple them, take away their ability to flee." "Firing now, Captain," came the response from the tactical officer. The human fleet fired a precise strike, and the Rilthar cruiser's engines exploded in a burst of fire. The remaining ships tried to regroup, but the damage had been done. The humans had taken control. As the final blow was struck and the Rilthar cruiser fell silent in space, Hayes couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just transpired. The war was not over, but humanity had sent a message. They had fought back not with the firepower of the Rilthar, but with something far more dangerous, human ingenuity and resolve. They thought it was mercy, Hayes whispered to himself. It wasn't. And with that, the battle was won. But the war, humanity's fight for survival, was far from over. The human fleet stood victorious, the final remnants of the Rilthar Empire scattered in space. The battle had been brutal, swift, and unexpected. But now, as Hayes stood on the bridge of the flagship, the weight of their success was undeniable. The Rilthar had been shattered, their fleet obliterated, and their pride crushed. Yet Hayes knew the galaxy had just witnessed the rise of something new, something powerful. The crew on the bridge stood at attention, their faces filled with quiet pride. But there was no cheering, no celebration. Hayes knew better. This was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for humanity. "Captain," Ava said, her voice steady, "the Rilthar fleet is completely neutralized. The distress signals we intercepted, those were their last plea for help." Hayes nodded slowly, his gaze still locked on the viewscreen. "We've made our point, but the galaxy won't forget this. The Rilthar might have been defeated, but they'll rebuild. They always do." Ava's expression darkened. "And when they do, they'll come back stronger. We've seen that before with other empires. This victory won't erase that threat." "No," Hayes replied, his voice firm. "But it will give us a chance to prepare. This wasn't just a fluke. The Rilthar saw something they weren't prepared for. They saw a species fighting for its survival, willing to sacrifice everything, and that's what'll keep us alive." He turned to face the crew. "Humanity isn't just fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for our place in the stars. The Rilthar have learned that. And soon, every empire in the galaxy will know it too." Ava nodded, her eyes hard with resolve. "We won't stop. Not now." Hayes's gaze drifted toward the stars outside the window. "No, this is only the beginning. And when the next battle comes, humanity will be ready." The war had just begun, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Rilthar had underestimated humanity, but they wouldn't make that mistake twice. Neither would anyone else.